Unit 11, Part 4, we'll be talking about Klenk's Unit 11, Section 3 on negated quantifiers. So we already talked quite a bit about what's involved in this section, back I think in my Part 2, Unit 11, Part 2. This is where you get the funny jokes. Klenk refers to Lewis Carroll, and the jokes based on recognizing the difference between, so I was talking about the statement, nobody loves me, right? You recognize it as an inappropriate response to say, oh, I'm so happy for you. I'm happy that there is somebody that loves you, namely the person named nobody, right? Haha, funny, because your understanding of the meaning of the sentence, nobody loves me, contains the recognition of the fact that nobody is not functioning as a name, is functioning differently than that, right? Is functioning as precisely a negated quantifier, right? Which is why it's inappropriate to say, when I say nobody loves me, oh good, the person named nobody, no, haha, funny, because I know that it's not a name, right? So anyway, it's in this section talking about negated quantifiers because, as I said back then in Part 2, really the great payoff, the great advance in our understanding of our own understanding, which is kind of what logic is, right? Our understanding of what it is we're understanding when we're understanding things, if you will, is that in a sentence like nobody loves me, nobody is functioning as the negation of the existential quantifier, right? It's the negation of the claim that there is somebody that loves me, right? So it's a complex logical analysis, but nobody loves me, right, is, you've got to recognize that first of all, in the, as it were, in the logical structure of that sentence, it's contained as a part, the claim, there exists an X such that X loves me, right, that there is somebody that loves me, and you've got to recognize nobody loves me. What is that sentence doing? What is the logical form of that sentence? This is the sentence that it is negating. Right? So it is a negation, and it's a negation of the claim that there exists a somebody that loves me. Right? Nobody means not somebody. Right? Or it is not the case that somebody, ... Okay, so that's crucial. And a lot of the translations, the test, and the quizzes and the exam will be testing your ability to recognize what combination of negation and quantifier is involved in translating certain English phrases, okay, and they can be quite tricky. You've got to learn to distinguish when the negation and the negation in the universal quantifier is appropriate to translate the sentence, and you've got to appreciate when the negation of the existential. So things like none, the word none, none of you will pass. What's that? That's the negation of the existential quantifier again, right? None of you will pass would be px, x will pass. What am I saying when I say none of you will pass? Again, I'm negating. This is the claim that at least one of you will pass. I'm saying, nope, none of you will pass, which importantly is equivalent to all of you will fail. So there's that, and also purely on the level of doing proofs involving the manipulation of formulas, there's going to be a lot of translating of, there's going to be these quantifier negation rules, which you're introduced to here in the next section, section 4 of Klenk's Unit 11. Quantifier negation equivalence rules. I lied when I said there's only 4 new rules for this section, for this quantifier logic. There's the 4 rules governing quantifiers: universal instantiation, existential instantiation, universal generalization, existential generalization, and there's also these quantifier equivalence relation, what are they called? Quantifier negation equivalences. Quantifier negation equivalences, section 4 of this section, and you'll see an application of it in Unit 12. There's categorical quantifier negation equivalences. And those are rules which you can use in proofs, right? So you'll be doing proofs, and you'll be translating negated quantifiers and citing as the justification of that, this is a rule that you can use, Qn, QN means quantify negation equivalence rules. That's the ones from Unit 11. Or another justification is CQN, categorical quantifier negation. So those are rules which you can apply. And you'll need to do so basically to turn negations into quantifier formulas. Right? Why? Because as Unit 14 will teach, only quantifier formulas are ready for the use of the instantiation and generalization rules. The real big rules that are the new ones for this part of the course, quantifier logic. All right, so let's see how quantifiers and negations go together in a couple of simple translations. Australians don't exist. That one is pretty easy to read from the surface. Right? What am I saying? I'm saying, as the propositional function, AX, X is Australian, I'm saying this statement, there exists an X such that X is Australian, isn't true, right? It's not the case, so this is how you read it. Remember, the negation, right, I've got to negate, the rules of negation still hold, you're still going to negate a legal formula. This is what you're negating, right? This complete formula, Australians exist, or there are some Australians, is how you read that. So you could read this as, it is not the case that Australians exist. It is not the case that there exists an X such that X is an Australian. That's a way, that's equivalent to, that's a presentation of the logical form of Australians don't exist. Okay? Compare, not everything is Australian. This one is actually, a lot of people get this wrong, but it's actually pretty easy. The thing you need to be able to do is distinguish the not everythings from the nones. There are none that. When you've got, none of you will pass, as we said, that's the negated existential, right? So when I'm saying nothing, right, nothing will do, nothing will do. What's that? Dx, x will do. There does not exist an x, such that x will do. So nothing, there are none, all these things that negated existentials. Different from not everything, very different meaning, right? Not everything is precisely, right, you can just sort of read the words off, you can read the symbols off, word for word. Not everything is, you use that? Not everything, not all. So first of all, recognize in your minds the big distinction between there are no Australians, right, it's going to be this one. So there are no Australians, you should recognize that's going to get the same, it's the same as this. There are no Australians, it's going to be, it's not the case that there exists an X, right? Pretty strong claim. There are no Australians. Whoa, there are no Australians? There does not exist a single Australian? Okay, that's very strong. Okay, I'm saying something very, very different to that when I say not everything is Australian. Not everything Australian happens to be true, right? Not everything Australian is much weaker. Not everything is Australian is very much compatible with there are some Australians, right? But not everything is Australian, so what's that? I just read these two words. These are logical words. I can read them. I can read the symbols for these off word for word. Not everything. Everything is always universal quantifier. Not everything is Australian is this. It's not the case that for all X, X is Australian. That's how you read this. What am I negating? I'm negating everything is Australian. Not everything is Australian. In fact, when you have not at the front of this, and often you're going to have, especially when you get to categorical sentences, and even more especially when you get categorical sentences with complex subjects and predicates, you're going to have sentences which have not, and then really long complex stuff, and it's going to take a lot of work to analyze the logical structure of the whole big long thing that follows the not. And I'll be recommending putting your hand over the not, right? If it's clear that what the not is negating is the whole thing, not every bear with cubs fights its attacker with blah, blah, blah. Right? It's going to be these complex bear with cubs examples in Unit 13. But what you should do is, if you can recognize that the not is negating the whole thing, forget about the not. When you're symbolizing, forget about the not. Just symbolize the whole sentence. And when you've got the whole formula out, chuck a negation on at the start. You're negating that whole thing. So it means in the order of construction, you're going to work out all this complex stuff, the harder ones that are coming, and then you just negate that whole thing, right? So a simple version of that is just doing this, right? Okay, forget about the not. Let's symbolize everything as Australian. Okay, For all x, AX. Done. That's everything in Australian. What's the sentence doing? It's negating that sentence. So just put a not at the front, because the not is negating the whole thing. Right, scope of negation, I should mention, scope of the negation here is, right, you don't just negate a quantifier. Quantifier is not a complete formula, right? It's for all x, AX. It's a sentence and that's a complete formula. Right. Although I should say, right, if you've got something like, something like and this is something else here, right? What's the scope of this negation? It is just the AX, right? This X would be bound by a quantifier outside, but the scope of this is AX. So you can have AX as a sort of complete formula that is that tells you what the scope of the negation is. But a quantifier itself won't do it, right? The quantifier itself can't be the scope of the negation. It's got to be the quantifier combined with a propositional function of some kind. All right. So not everything is Australian. Not for all x, AX. There are no Australians. I'm denying existence. You've got to be able to read that as denying existence. There are no Australians. There are none of them. It is not the case that there exists an X such that X is Australian. All right. Okay. Let's try this one. Some things are not Australian. Okay, do it as literally as you can. Some things I'm asserting existence. This is a existential statement. There exists an X, and such that what? Such that that X is not Australian. So it's like this. There exists an X such that not a X. Right? There exists an X such that it is not the case that X is Australian. That's how you read that. Don't be weirded out by the fact that there's a negation sign here. That's fine, right? That's a formula. That's the scope of the thing negated by the existential quantifier. There exists an X such that it is not the case that X is Australian. There are some things for which this propositional function is true. There exists an X, at least one thing, for which this propositional function is true. There exists an X such that X is not Australian. Some things are not Australian, right? Whenever you're doing these, either way, English to symbols, symbols to English, always translate back, always read back the symbols many times. Make sure your English phrasing for the symbols, which you have to do a lot of practice to get good at, make sure your English phrasing for the symbols is at least logically equivalent to whatever your original English sentence is, if you're going that way. All right, everything is not Australian. Okay, again, let's do it literally. Everything, so it is a universal statement, right? Everything is not Australian. For all x, what? For all x, what? Every x is such that x is not Australian. For all x, not AX. Okay? All right, pause here, and then we'll talk about quantifier negation equivalences. So translating these, swapping the negations and the quantifiers. I'll say how to do so in the next part.